Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm Patrick, and I'm one of the organizers of this event, and which is taking place during the Umundo Festival in Lisbon and the Umundo Festival in Dresden. So before I go over to introduce our main guest, Daniel Wahl, and the subject of this event, which is tackling climate change through ecosystem restoration, I would like to share some words about what our festival is about. So the Umundo Festival is or at least started as a grassroots festival in Germany more than 10 years ago. So it's taking place for the 13th time this year. And in Portugal, we started also this festival last year for the first time. So it is taking place for the second time. And it's a festival which invites the population and different organizations locally, but also on a regional, or even as we have today on an international level, to rethink the way we as humanity are doing things, and the impact our economical system, our way of producing, of living, and so on is having on the planet, and how to tackle these problems with sustainable, regenerative solutions, and also thinking about climate change, which is coming for sure, how to create resilience to this reality. And so in Portugal, this festival started 2 days ago and is taking place until next Tuesday, which is a holiday in Portugal, where we will have a market for the Portuguese listeners here. Will take place in Lisbon in the garden of Príncipe Real. So you will have the possibility to meet some organizations, some actors there, and so my invitation to visit the program. I will just quickly share the URL. Just 1 second, please. So we have www.umundu.pt. That's the Portuguese page. So we have 90 events taking place over these 6 days. So please feel invited to visit the program. Some of the events are online, all of them in Portuguese. But if you're not in Lisbon, you're invited to participate online. And then we have the German festival, which started a few days ago, the 24th of September. And it is taking place until today. So today is the last day. Just to mention that this is a joint event of these two festivals. Now, I would like very quickly to introduce our guests, and mainly my special guest, Daniel Wahl. Hello, how are you? I will just say very quick, short words about Daniel, but I think during the conversation we will have today, you will really understand what Daniel's work is all about. So Daniel is we could say one of the catalysts of the rising regeneration movement, and also author of the book Designing Regenerative Cultures, which I have here, but we will be talking about this probably more times during this conversation. So he's working as a consultant, educator, and activist with different NGOs, businesses, and governments, and also agents of change. He grew up in Germany, studied biology in Scotland and California, and wrote a PhD in design for human and planetary health in 2006. And since 2010, he's living in Mallorca, in Spain, growing roots and deepening his practice of facilitating bioregional regeneration. So, Daniel, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I will introduce also now Nuno da Silva, which is...
First, let me say thank you for the invitation, and even more so, thank you for putting the effort into organizing festivals like this. It's so important.
And
it's a lot of work.
Yeah, and it's really important to say, and that's the amazing thing. If you think about a festival with 90 events, everyone in the team is voluntary. So people are doing their job during the day. And for a month now, every evening we have been having calls to put this together, and so it's really something different, I would say. And now I will add our second guest. Let me just change the view here. So we have Nuno da Silva. He will be talking about himself also in a few moments, but to sum up, he's also doing work in the field of regenerative cultures in Portugal, also doing consultancy with different groups and organizations in general. And I think I will pass now on the word to Nuno da Silva, and I will leave the stage for you both to talk about today's subject, landscape restoration, maybe as a way to tackle climate change, and that through regenerative cultures. So it's a long title.
Thank you, Patrick.
And I welcome also everyone here. I see that by the second more people are joining. So talk to you later, and please, Nuno and Daniel, it's my pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Patrick. I guess this is a great place to start our conversation, Daniel, to really express the gratitude to all the things that had to take place for the two of us and to be here today talking, particularly the wonderful team that is organizing this festival, but I mean, all sorts of things, the wind, the water, all the elements, all the different stories that thousands of years of evolution in this planet that brought us to this place. And we are indeed living a very unique moment in human history, right? It feels like daunting at times, quite challenging, but it's really becoming more and more clear to more and more people around the world that we are in a turning point, somehow at the crossroads of humanity and what it means to be human in this planet. And one of the things I've been hearing mostly present in most of the conversations going around is this aspect of VUCA, of a world that is very volatile, more and more uncertain, very complex, and often ambiguous, because the same situation can be experienced and understood in multiple ways. And I guess the pandemics has been amplifying all that. And one of the things I'm kind of very strongly aware of, you are very close to the Cumbre of La Vieja. You are in one of the islands there. There's the active volcano there. We have, at the moment in Europe, 3 active volcanoes. So there's also this sense that nature, that the planet as a whole is not only humans, is the whole planet is going through a major shift. And we know that through history that it has gone through major shifts in the past. Perhaps this is the first time that we as humanity are going through such a major shift in the planet as a whole, because we are all interconnected and it's very easy to understand what's going on in different parts of the planet. And we were invited to have a conversation around how restoration can address these challenges. And you are here because you wrote this wonderful book, not only, but one of the reasons is you wrote this wonderful book. I advise everybody to have a look at it. Daniel, after his PhD on natural design, wrote this, and for me, it's a Bible. And I think for most people working with regeneration, it's a sort of a Bible, because it kind of, you manage to offer a very extensive view of the landscape of what was going on in all sorts of fields of human endeavor that could give us hints on what could regenerative cultures look like. And in a way, for me, it's like, what are the hints at the movements that we as a collective species need to do in this stage if we want to have the future generations having a context of life that where they can prosper with health and vitality and viability in the ecosystems. So I would like to really start from a very personal perspective of like, Daniel, what's your relation with this theme, with restoration? How you came to decide to dedicate your life to this work, and in a way also very, from a very personal place, how you are living this turmoil of the moment of the world we are living in. How are you experiencing this as a human being in your own backyard of the world, like your own little spot in the planet? Hi, great to have another conversation with you. Really excited.
Wonderful to get another chance to speak with you, Nuno. Well, you opened up so many possible avenues with what you said. I mean, one thing that I find really useful as a framing is to actually hold this idea that because somewhere, depending on where on the planet, 500 or many more years ago, we began to not appreciate indigenous practice and indigenous knowledge enough. We began to call it primitive knowledge rather than understand it as the kind of collective inheritance of a species that over thousands and 10,000s and hundreds, thousands of years had evolved in intimate mutualism with the ecosystems in which they lived in a very bioregional way. So in many ways, I think it's really important as now this regenerative culture meme and regeneration is becoming more and more popular, to not sell it as the new kid on the block and a new way of doing things. It is a new way of doing things, but it is at the same time also a very ancient way of doing things. And I think it has much more power as a response to, not even a response to climate change, a response to something much, much deeper, of which climate change is a symptom. And it is basically replanting us as human beings back into place. It's what the beautiful, there's a beautiful talk that the poet Gary Snyder gave in 1977 at a conference on re-inhabitation, re-inhabiting the earth. And it was part of the impulse of the bioregional movement in the Bay Area and in California at the time. And this notion of that we're now called to face this Wacker complexity. I don't necessarily like the Wacker training so much, because basically what Wacker is talking about is uncertainty. It's saying we falsely let science give us a story that science has done wonderful things and technology has done that too. So I'm not against them in any way, but the reductionist scientific approach has given us this false belief that we can predict and control the living world. And since every aspect of the living world, every cell in your body, every organ in your body, you yourself, your family, your community, the ecosystem you call home, they're all complex dynamic systems, and they're all nested in the way that they're interrelated. Like we need to hold the possibility that this whole individual and species thinking that we are separate from life as individuals is a reality, but at the same time, there's another equal reality, which is that all of it is life as a planetary process, that life is actually something that englobes all of this. And for me, regeneration doesn't only go back to the origins of our species, of being healing custodian cultures of the bioregional ecosystems in which we lived everywhere around the planet. And now we were getting the science that the Amazon rainforest, the old growth forest of the Pacific Northwest, the ancient lost forest gardens of Europe, the entire Iberian Peninsula with its oak culture. We basically had, as species, nurtured ecosystems but through skillful disruption to nurture a more abundant and more productive ecosystem, we've been gardening the planet as a species, and we were regenerative cultures everywhere. And that gives us a lot more strength in saying, if we've done it before, we can try to do it again. And of course, it's not a going back to a golden past, like it is, how do we bring modern technological civilization through a transformative process into a deeper relationship with place and earth again, to the level that, and I think this is the absolute crux for me that I've sort of more and more come to. It's the Kunian perspective cube, when the cube is one side is forward and the other side is forward. Like, the world is very different when you say this piece of land belongs to me, whether it's as a private owner or as a nation, a national government or whatever. If you say, I am an expression of this piece of earth, like this, I belong to this land, and you really aim to be living in such a way that you express your potential, and the only way you can fully, in this nested wholeness, express your own true potential is in service to the wider system that you're embedded in. And we all knew this, and all indigenous nations, indigenous knowledge around the world still has this core element in it. That's why you find over and over again in indigenous cultures this tripartite question of any decision that has significance. Does it serve myself? Does it serve my community? And does it serve life? Very simple. And for me, to bring it back because you started, where am I at? Is really this how, now that there's a global uprising of people talking about regenerative culture and ecosystems restoration, and we're at the beginning of the UN Decade of Ecosystems Restoration, and there's such potential for global networking and weaving alliances and all that. At the same time, I feel like it's very, very easy to disappear in the virtual world of online networking. And as with everything in life, if you choose to put your attention in one place, you have less attention to give in another place. And I'm personally at this moment of trying to be really vigilant of how can I shift the focus of my attention to the piece of land I'm now the custodian of, my neighbors as a community that could potentially create a community-owned renewable energy microgrid together, and in the process form relationships through this building a co-op together that are actually the true value of the years that are coming towards us now. The turbulent transition years where climate change, no matter, even if we get it right and we begin to do the right things, climate change will test us in many ways, and we need to come back to place, and we need to come back to community, and we need to build resilience on so many levels: local and bioregional food sovereignty, water sovereignty, energy sovereignty. And the best way to do it is through community. Like, we're all so busy in our lives that to just make the mental note, I want to see these friends at least once a month, very quickly at the end of the year you realize, oh, I've seen them twice a year. But if you have a co-op together, then you have to have your monthly meeting to briefly do what needs to be done, and then you're already together. Then you stay the evening together and build community. And so this is where I feel like I want to put more attention to these seemingly little things, but that are actually solving the global problem. Because and I'll pass it back to you in a second. I just the one other thing about the framing of what our conversation is supposedly about, in terms of responding to climate change. I'm glad that it didn't mention climate change as a problem. It just says we need to respond to it. Obviously, we need to respond to it. But you're also part of the European regenerative practitioner community that is rapidly growing and very strongly growing in Portugal, which is wonderful. And And I think one of the really big framing helps that I have gotten through Carol Samford and Regenesis Group and the regenerative practitioner training is this: how do I look at things not through the lens of a problem, climate change as a problem, but through potential. And I'm not saying the potential of climate change, but the potential of place. Like the minute we say, what is the potential of ecosystems restoration to respond to climate change, then we can say it's actually so much more than responding to climate change. It's building community. It's bringing people back together again to be proud of their place. It's creating opportunities where people shoulder on shoulder can plant trees and say, what would it be like if we felt as expressions of this place rather than owners of this place? If we made it our purpose to be healing keystone species in this ecosystem and pass this entire watershed over to our grandchildren in a way that it is more abundant, has more rainfall. And because when we plant trees, we plant water. Like everything is interconnected. I just briefly, because this is framed around climate change, I looked up one of the Bibles on climate change and carbon counting, Paul Hawkins' book Drawdown, and looked at the different, he's got 100 solutions and they're sort of ranked in terms of impact. And it's piecemeal to talk about just ecosystems restoration, because done well, place sourced out of a community and a bioregion with an identity where people really look in and begin to heal not just the local watershed, but the local fiber shed, the local energy shed, the local other materials sheds for construction and so on, like to really begin to look at what do we need to build a healthy, vibrant, regenerative circular economy, and how is this region defined in a kind of fluid way, not with rigid boundaries. And in this book, it's fascinating to see that, just briefly looking through it, regenerative agriculture is on place 11. Tree intercropping, so basically agroforestry, beginning the shift towards agroforestry, is on place 17. Conservation agriculture, planting more native trees around agricultural fields, is on 16. Composting on 60. Tropical staple trees on 14. Irrigation on 64. Managed grazing on 19. Forest protection on 38. Coastal wetlands on 52. Tropical trees on 15. Bamboo, perennial crops, peatlands, indigenous land management, temperate forests, afforestation, all of them are individually listed. But if we take a bioregional regeneration approach, everything I've just said is a holistic, integrated healing strategy that is aimed at increasing the potential of the place to be vibrant, productive, and resilient. And in the process, building the capacity of the people to find solutions that are not implemented forever, because we're in changing times. They're solutions that work and are local, and we get feedback of them quickly because we're working at the appropriate regional and local scale, and we keep learning. And that, for me, is what realigning with life's regenerative impulse is about. It's not about finding fixed solutions and then forcing them on everybody. It's seeing solutions as transient ways of really learning how to even improve our ability to be of healing significance in the ecosystems we live in. So it's a much bigger question than just carbon.
Wow. Thank you, Daniel. You touched on so many things that I resonate with. Perhaps I would like to, just as a starting point of what you said, you remind me of a sentence that a colleague of mine, Bayo Akomolafe, says often, that is always saying, perhaps the way we are responding to crisis is part of the crisis. And when I hear you, I'm thinking like one of the things that we need as a starting point when we want to think about change and the kind of things we need to put in place to tackle the challenges we have is really changing the way we think. We often have this sense of, the more if only we could do more things will change. There's this sense of you have to put the energy and do. And I see a lot of activists and a lot of people trying to generally produce change, but with that kind of mindset, which is very dominant in our society of humans making things happen. If humans don't make things happen, things will not evolve. And when I hear issues about the stories about indigenous people recognizing that 80% of the pristine territories, ecosystems in the planet are lands managed by indigenous people, so obviously there's a lot to learn with them. And I get a sense also because you said science didn't make only bad things, it brought us a lot of evolution. So I get a sense that we need to integrate these two worlds of how much we brought in from our capacity to distinguish things and to separate and look at things from different ways, with that ancient indigenous, that way of being in the land, in relationship, that brings learnings from thousands of years of being in a deep relationship with place. And so for me, it gets this very strong, this sense that I want to just reinforce that kind of the change needs to start really at the origin in our way of thinking, right? And you said, like, we often are focused on problems, and I get a feeling if all of us listening to all of you listening to us now, if you really get an exercise of doing like a focus on what are the problems you see around you and in your life, and you can get a moment to spend in that exercise, it's quite draining. It kind of brings this energy of, because problems are, you have an immensity of problems around. And if we're starting to solve problems, my experience in my daily life being a father of twins is I always need to run around trying to solve things, and it's never ending. It's a never ending thing. But when we shift towards looking at potential, to looks what is happening here and what new possibilities I can bring into this situation from deep inside myself that can then generate new possibilities in the environment, it's another energy. You get this excitement, this enthusiasm, and then I think that there's something crucial there that I think before we go to concepts like, restoration, regeneration, everything, really coming back to the basic human gestures that on a daily basis we can use. This is at the heart of it, really.
Yeah, and it actually it goes further. This, like, it's really a powerful reframing. It's not just a little linguistic kind of how nice to say, we should not focus on problems, we should focus on potential, because the minute that the entire way that we've been educated pretty much everywhere in the world now, because the colonialist attitude has basically also exported a certain model of education from Europe to the world, and with it came a certain way of thinking, and it is the problem-solving thinking, and so we end up having a knee-jerk response, a pattern that says, okay, here's the problem, let's define this problem, and in the definition we actually abstract it. We don't look at it as the problem in this place with these people on this day in this wider context as a short-term manifestation of a dynamic process. No, we're beginning to say, well, this problem happens in a lot of places, and then we create solutions in this abstract mind space. And then we try to implement these solutions by economic means, because the other knee-jerk response is, we have a solution, let's scale it up. And then we force a solution on people that might not need that solution in that way, or if they really want to get the positive effects of that solution, they actually have to have come to the point that they need that solution themselves. And so that's the big shift in working regeneratively, that it's not anti-problem and anti-solution in that sense, but instead of getting a mindset that ultimately, because that's another framing that we're not really conscious of, which is that even when we talk about what now lies ahead of us, we talk about it as a transition. And that's a wonderful conversation I had with Chris Johnson, Joanna Macy's colleague when I interviewed him about the active hope process he just started. He actually said to me that he had conversations with Joanna Macy, that even this framing of the great turning, like living in the great turning between the industrial growth society and the life-sustaining society, wonderful, powerful framing, still gives us a mental scaffolding that makes us believe that one day we will arrive in this future and then we can down tools and live happily ever after. And I think the major jump of trying to respond to climate change and ecosystems change and human evolution as a dynamic participant in that process that offers becoming a regenerative practitioner is to understand that the focus is the capacity of journeying, the capacity of continuing to be on that journey, and that in order to avoid this abstraction kind of escape, it has to be grounded even more than that. It's another beautiful phrase. They're very careful with language in the regenerative group, place sourced. That it's not even just our ideas of the people in that place, but it's with the humility of saying, like that mind shift we talked about earlier, if we're really not owners of this place, but expressions of this place, then how do we increase our ability again to listen to the story of this place that isn't just a human story, that is often told through the myths and the ecological and indigenous knowledge of the place, but it's also a story that we can get told through the landscape and through connecting to a wider community of life to truly begin to humbly be of service to a place again and nurture ecosystems to their maximum abundance. And I think that if we do this, we will live into a climate change response a little bit without even noticing so on, because we'll be focused rather than on a problem and constantly having global meetings about how we're doing and have you measured the carbon lately, to going into place and saying, we know that all these things I just listed in, like that somebody asked in the chat earlier, can we have a table with all these numbers that Daniel just riddled off? If you just put Project Drawdown in Google, you'll find this ranking. But so many of the 100 top solutions to draw down enough carbon to respond to climate change that Paul Hawken and his amazing team of scientists pulled together in this book are basically systemically implementable and integratable at a bioregional scale. But we have to do so through a participatory process in each place where people are asked, how do we respond not just to climate change, but to a brittle VUCA world in this place? And it would address so many other issues. It will solve water crises. It will solve the energy crisis. It will create food resilience. It will build vibrant regional economies again. It's finding the nuanced both and approach to say, what is it that we need to cooperate globally on in terms of production and consumption to truly enable vibrant regional economies? Not to say one or the other, but to say, can we, and like it's a guess, but I think it's possible as a numeric ideal to get roughly to 80% bioregional production for bioregional consumption. And on the basis of that, create a very vibrant, like employment, meaning, engagement in healing the local ecosystem, in creating social cohesion and basically living well together, shifting from artificial scarcity to shared abundance, because we stop telling a mistaken competitive story. I think it's possible, but it's only possible if at the same time we maintain the gift of globalization and collaboration to enable it through 20% of global technologies. We don't want to lose the capability of talking in Dresden, Lisbon, and Mallorca, not the Canary Islands, at the same time.
Yeah, you're in America. Yeah, you touched on so many things. I was going back to this notion that the major shift needs to happen in the way we think. I'm kind of hearing you and thinking like, yeah, we need to kind of go beyond just the desire to do good, to really work from within a living systems perspective, which is what I'm hearing you saying and what we both try to do in our practice, which involves somehow unpacking and unlearning a lot of things, or integrating this more like analytic, scientific way of thinking with this more intuitive, essence thinking, connecting with places. And you just recalled me one of the things I was involved for some months in trying to create an intentional community in the center of Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that struck me most in that process was that you had this group of people, and we were talking about, there was generated a lot of interest. Talking in at the moment was like almost 1,000 people interested in following up how this community was going to be created, what's going to be look like, so that they can think if they want to be involved or not. But what struck me most was most people were thinking we want to do an eco village, and it didn't matter the place. It could be anywhere. So when they were they found a place and they were working there, they were not looking at the place. They were looking at their own ideas of what an eco village should look like. And I think that's part of the essence of what we're talking here, that working with living systems and working in a way that allows the restoration of ecosystems and regeneration of new possibilities for life on this planet involves having a deep understanding that each living creature, each living place is unique, and there's something unique, as a unique role to address in the world, and that things are holes nested within holes, as you said. So we need to stop thinking things in a fragmented way, which is one of the problems. You see how governments are organized, how often we organize the way we work in teams and different departments, and that kind of fragments more and more the way we look at reality, and that becomes a problem when we start to think like how to work with in a way that allows ecosystems regeneration, because then we need to start to think things in relationship, as you said, and look what is unique in the different aspects of this system that makes this system unique, and how it contributes uniquely to the other systems it's part of. So yeah, can you talk us
let me go in there briefly, because I think this is a really important point for some of the people who are listening who might be actively involved in the UN Decade of Ecosystems Restoration. I'm working here on Mallorca with a number of friends who are in different organizations involved mainly in marine protection and marine regeneration, marine conservation, and increasingly in terrestrial projects of reforestation through agroforestry systems and so on and so forth. And what I've learned through this process, and also through some conversations that I've been in with meetings between large doer foundations that are actually engaging in active work of ecosystems restoration and agroforestry and agriculture, and larger foundations interested in funding regenerative efforts, is that we have to watch out that a lot of the very conventional players in the nature conservancy, for example, that nature preservation and conservation, the classical model of let's create a ecosystems reserve and make sure nobody goes there so nature's protected, as if we can sort of lock it away into a little cupboard and say, oh, we've got a little piece of pristine rainforest there, that's very nice. That is not understanding how life works. Like, science has moved on. We understand the planetary evolving system so much better now than we did when the paradigms of nature conservation and preservation were drawn up. And like, I actually get frustrated because there's such fascinating, well-meaning people, real luchadoras and luchadores that are trying to make a difference, but they're stuck in this mustn't have any species that aren't from here. Like, it's almost like an ideal image that some sort of scientific paper has created of what that ecosystem should look like, and then you try to remanage it back into the static state, and that's like an allopathic approach to health. It's like going back to some ideal state. But the salutogenic approach to health is the dynamic evolutionary regenerative growing into health as a dynamic process, capacity to respond to change in the environment. And it's the same for ecosystems. If we want to really do ecosystems restoration, por favor, let's not do it in the carbon myopic mindset of the current COP26 carbon counting, carbon metrics focused approach, which is necessary to keep us moving. But we need to, I don't want to underrail anything that good people are doing to make COP26 a success. But we need to, at the same time as we continue to talk about carbon reduction to 2050 and 2030 and all of that, we need to see that this is dangerously monothematic and that we also need to do so much more. And it's right there where if we begin to understand that what we actually need to do by re-inhabiting ecosystems, bringing economies back into the ecosystem, redesigning regional economies in such a way that the economy itself becomes an engine of regeneration, because it needs to shift local land use towards much more productive and healed landscapes. It needs to use local water in the utmost perfection in order to irrigate dry lands and make them more productive, and plant enough biomass to bring back the rains and increase the capacities of the soil to keep the water in the soil. All of that is much more complex. It's healing landscapes. It's healing entire watersheds. It's about soil building. It's about planting. It's about building community in the process. It's about creating micro enterprises, a pride of place, a story of place. It's about a whole new way of doing education, a whole new way of doing tourism. All of these offer opportunities for doing something that really would say, wow, in this place, we have a unique potential to do all these things and bring them together in a way that no other place on earth will do it. While every other place on earth will be engaged in exactly the same mission, which is to create a regenerative place-sourced culture in that bioregion. They will do it in their way and we will do it in our way. And we won't compete against each other. We share as much as possible between climate zones. Have you tried this? This is roughly the same climate. It might work for you. Let's not be dogmatic. That's one of the, I sometimes get a taste in the Regenesis group that they just distinguish language from one to the other in such a way that it very quickly sounds like a dismissing other. It's not meant that way, but it sounds like that. And I try to keep the bridge open. I believe that there are people doing biomimicry in a way that can be regenerative. They're doing people's circular economy in a way that can be regenerative. There are people doing business and or regenerative tourism, which is a paradoxon in some ways, but you can do it in a way that is truly regenerative, which is when you engage the local people into a participatory process that changes you and changes them and is sourced out of the bioregion itself and the knowledge of place and the story of place, and that we can learn from, in that community. Case studies or best practice examples are quickly dismissed. I think we can learn from best practice examples, but not in a copy-paste way. We have to say, they've done that in Porto. Let's see, with a lot more south in Lisbon. Does it actually work? It's about adapting and also really humbly asking the local culture and the local place, what is the solution for this place? Rather than thinking that looks really cool over there in that other part of the world and we want one of those. That's the old way of doing things.
Yeah, so many things coming in. I guess one of the things I'm hearing you say, Daniel, is that actually instead of looking at the change in terms of reorganizing things or shifting things from place, and I think is you're pointing at that change happens in the relationships, and it's in this place in between where the way we interact, humans with humans with the places we inhabit, it's in that in between place where change fundamentally needs to take place. So there's something there that's really interesting for me, because I do think like none of the people listening to us, none of us wakes up in the morning thinking, oh, I'm going to wake up today and make the world the worst place and destroy nature and make life worse to other human beings. But collectively, somehow that's what we are all doing together, right? So there's something here about the need to change fundamentally the way we relate with each other and with the places. And I was thinking, like with my kids, like if I think like the formal school system I went through was based on this idea of the ideal student. At the end of the educational system, you'll reach that place and you'll be ready for life. You'll have achieved that ideal end of student life person. And how much pain and suffering that system has created, because you are always having to fulfill yourself towards an ideal that is outside, and never we are still lacking to develop systems of education where people can really work from their essence, which is part of what we're talking about, and then the essence of the places they inhabit, so that they are in a deep relationship that really can bring new value or higher order of value into the systems. And I think that's something fundamental, because restoration, to me, that's one of the limits of thinking restoration by itself is it kind of brings me to a place of restore it back to a certain place where it was ideal, as you said. And I think for me it's more and more clear, I resonate with you a lot, that there's no such place. It's the same as cultures. Looking back to the original culture, there's no such thing. Life is always in the process of relationship, always recreating itself and creating new possibilities. And what does that mean for us humans in the place we are today? And all of us listening here, I think all of us are committing, being on a Saturday afternoon, hearing this conversation, we are all committed to do the best we can for a better, more beautiful world. Our hearts know it's possible to come into life. So can we talk a bit now, using the last half an hour, a bit more we have, on like what can we concretely do at this intersection of restoration, regeneration, to really step up our work in ways that can offer new possibilities? Because obviously continuing to do responses the way we've been doing is not generating new possibilities. And so in a sense, it's like we see a lot of things going on that kind of makes us more and more concerned and creates anxiety. Where do you see this bubbling new possibilities, new gestures, new ways of being in relationship that offer possibilities for more regenerative cultures to emerge as we go forward?
Again, I think what's really important, or at least that's where I'm moving more and more in the work that I'm wanting to do locally, where in the bioregion I live on the island of Mallorca. A little bit analogous to the let's not position this idea of what we now need to create being entirely a progress-oriented new thing that we have to co-create, and that we just found out that we need to do it, and so we're starting from scratch and basically running out of time with kind of on the brink of irreversible climate meltdown. I think that's overwhelming. But if we, on two levels, on the really deep taproot into deep time, into our species history, recognize that we have been regenerative cultures before, that already helps. But if we go even further than that, if we shift, you're saying that ultimately the shift is in the worldview. If we shift the story of, you're indirectly quoting Charles Eisenstein there with the title, more beautiful word our heart knows is possible, the framing of the story of separation and the story of interbeing. Like if we really is the same framing as re-inhabitation or coming home to place, becoming expressions of place again. But even beyond that, it's shifting into life as a planetary process and understanding life as a regenerative community that has over 3.8 billion years made this planet more inhabitable for more life. Constantly, the overall, no matter how little bit of competition here and there and extinction phases and all that went on, the overall march towards syntropy, not entropy, has happened on planet Earth for 3.8 billion years. So it would be fair to say that maybe life in itself is a syntropic force. The process of life is stemming the tide of entropy and the march towards dissolution. And the way that this has always happened is out of place, in place, and in region. And the danger is that we will losing valuable time in trying to do this at the global scale. Like a common friend and mentor of ours, Bill Reed, in a conversation to me at the beginning of this year or last year, can't remember, just sort of said, Daniel, it's mistaken to think that we can heal the planet. We can only heal places, or save the planet. We can only save places. And it's again what we already talked about. It's instead of going into the abstraction of this overwhelming global problem that there's so many of them. We still need global coordination. We need, like, it's never an either or. But if we all spend much more attention on manifesting the potential of ourselves in our community, in a place nested in a bioregion, and understood those activities within the wider context of what now needs to happen everywhere in all places, and kept an open mind that whatever spare capacity we have or learning we have, that we can easily, without much detraction and another 50 Zoom calls, share with people elsewhere and support them in their place-sourced work of responding not just to climate change, but responding to the effects of 5,000 years of the era of empires, the era of power over, the era of telling more and more the story that nature and culture are separate, and forgetting the ancient story that we are custodians of life, that we're custodians of places. And coming back to that, and in that suddenly we can see everybody in the new place saying, here I'm on Mallorca. 50% of the people on Mallorca are Mallorcans, 30% are Spanish, 10% or 15% are German. There are lots of Latin Americans. Let's not fissure that society into, each little group, but let's come together with that diversity and see the potential that all places on the land through this mixing that has happened and moving around and all that. Now we have new potential in each place, and we have one marching order, which is, how do we re-inhabit this place and ensure that we pass it on to our grandchildren in a much, much healthier condition than it is now? How do we meet our basic needs in the turbulent times of the next 2 or 3 decades of climate chaos? How do we meet core needs in this region, out of this region, in ways that actually help the region to regenerate? And if we ask those questions and then engage in those processes, then out of that will spiral a new civic cohesion, a new meaning in a world that is kind of lost in manufacture's descent. You're muted.
I've noticed there's some questions already coming in, but before we go there, also because in a way, because of what the questions are hinting is, we often look at I get a general feeling from people I talk around, my friends, close family, that there's this sense of impotence, that like the system oppress people, and the problem is the system, so something out there, and that people have no agency in doing that. And when I look at this story you were just talking about, I mean, we've been at least a century, much more than that, of this kind of movement towards individualism, materialism, this sensation of separation, this narrative, which left us in a place of very traumatized cultures and traumatized people. And I think that's, for me, it's something that I wanted to point out, because last year we had a talk within a conference I organized around conflict transformation, which came from that kind of disturbing observation that most of the energy of change that is going on around the world often gets dispersed because of incapacity of humans, of us to come together and work together and go through the difficulties together. And I think there's something there at the heart, because people are asking about, well, finances need to change, and the way funding happens, and the way, obviously, all the systems we have in place are built and are a manifestation of a certain way of being and thinking in the world, of which we are part of because we grow up in that world. And we are asking now to move towards new possibilities which are not new. So in a way, I am being invited, as you said, to reconnect deeply with our ancestry, with our roots of lives deeply embedded in place. And I'm kind of feeling like we are at the intersection of trying to integrate those things. And I just wanted to point out this because for everybody hearing us, all of us have agency in changing the way things are. And that is about how we go in each situation, how we bring ourselves in and not get frustrated and go away and then compromise or even fly away from situations of conflict and of tension. Because in a way, I feel that those tensions, either between humans or even in the ecosystems we are part of, are pointing us towards the direction of where we need to put attention and work together with, right? So a big shift in terms of, it goes back to problems versus potential. Is like, instead of being focused on a problem that we need to sort out and solve, how we can have a deeper listening to what is it that we want to be informed in the way we are relating with each other in the plan and the places, so that healing can take place. And I know you think a lot about these things, so I just wanted to get a perspective from you before we go to the more systemic questions.
Well, first of all, there's something that every time I do a webinar on StreamYard, I get difficulties in pasting links to everybody who's listening. So I just in the private chat pasted a bunch of links of organizations that are worth looking at, just as general, like if people are kind of hungry, this is a high level talk, which is all really important, kind of what's behind all this. But there's wonderful organizations, like I put the link to the Decade of Ecosystems Restoration that the UN has called starting this year. Common Land Foundation in the Netherlands, Ecosystems Restoration Camp is growing rapidly all around the world. I've had the real privilege of being on the advisory board of both of those organizations. And then there's the Global Landscapes Forum has created this 1,000 landscapes for 1 billion people approach to really looking at landscape scale regeneration. And so this conversation is really happening also in a regenerative way. They, like within Common Earth, which is another link that I should put, it's common.earth, is an initiative within the Commonwealth Secretariat to take regenerative place-sourced practice to policymakers in 54 Commonwealth nations. And then there's really wonderful small projects like the Regenerosity that grew out of the Lush Spring Prize for Regeneration, which is a small, it's regenerosity.world, I believe. It helps small place-sourced regeneration projects around the globe to keep doing their good work. Because there's also a problem with the way currently we're funding mega projects, or even philanthropic and good positive funders still have the blind spot that in order to decrease their overheads, they're trying to basically say, like, if we have 3 million to give away, better give away 6 lots of 500,000 to big grants, or even 1 million each to 3 organizations, rather than get lost in 100 or 150 small grants that we all have to manage. That's just going to gobble up too much of the money, and therefore we won't do it. But I believe we need to find new ways to fund like spending a lot of money on funding many small projects in place. And I think we would actually have a much more systemic impact that way. But sorry, you asked about the. Just remind me in a couple of sentences about your question, because I
was talking more, because people often look at regeneration and restoration and regeneration as something outside of us. So we need to restore nature around.
I'm already there.
It was just like coming to the inside, so that there's no separation between outwards and inwards. So that, because also that touches with this aspect of people feeling powerless. And towards moving towards understanding that we all have agency in shaping the future and in shaping reality. And because that's for me a big problem, a big concern. Like, everybody around feels powerless because the system they feel the system imposes reality and the life dynamics on them. And I think that's something that needs to fundamentally shift.
Yeah, it's fascinating how narrative is a powerful form of design that ultimately creates enabling constraints for cultures. And if it's been going on for long enough, it becomes repeated to the point that we actually create our own reality spaces in which we believe that narrative. And the narrative of the cog in the machine comes out of hundreds of years since the mechanistic scientific worldview really got traction, and we began to look at things as clockworks or computers, and now we're describing consciousness with computer metaphors. It's the same energy that also puts us into this kind of, since we seem to suggest that culture and nature, self and world, are fundamentally separate, then it creates that whole fear, need for control. All of this is related. But when we actually look at the cutting edge of modern science, complexity science, and Earth systems sciences, and even the Human Biome Project, we begin to see that these rigid boundaries of individuals and other species are not as rigid. I've said it many times before, like in you and in me are more non-human cells than there are human cells in our bodies. We're each and every, like, just as these individuals, we're already ecosystems and not individuals. But then we're, of course, nested in our communities. And the participatory worldview that comes out of complexity sciences, that is a basically scientific reframing of the indigenous worldviews of interbeing and interconnectedness, is basically saying that because everything is interconnected, we will never be able to predict it and control it beyond a very limited time and space. So let's give up on control and let's ask, what would appropriate participation look like? I learned this from my mentor, Professor Brian Goodwin, in the Masters in Holistic Science at Schumacher College 20 years ago. And he is a co-founder of the Santa Fe Institute of Complexity Science and blah, blah, blah. And for me, that's an elemental lesson, because the minute you understand that you can't but participate. Another very bright thinker, Professor Gerald Mitchley, professor for systems thinking at the University of Hull, says everything is an intervention. I mean, go for a walk with that sentence, sit on a rock with that sentence, or on the beach. Everything is an intervention. Because
even
if you
doing nothing or not speaking, right? Even the choice even the choice of doing nothing or being in silence is an intervention.
Absolutely. That's the key point. If we understand that because we are in this larger system and we are this larger system, as long as we're alive and participating, we are changing the world every second. In the minutest ways, we're changing carbon composition every time we breathe in and out in the atmosphere. We're contributing to it. What we choose in our diet emits more or less methane, to make it really simple. All those kind of things. But every time, like, once you begin to see the world as this constant transforming, living whole process, this coming to grips with our participation creates a sort of paradoxical dual response, to my mind, if you appropriately respond, which is, on the one hand, personally, like, maybe I take it back to myself, when I really sit with this insight, I get, on the one hand, very humble, because I really hold uncertainty, not knowing, and having to act wisely in the face of not knowing and never being able to know all of it. So that is an invitation to deep humility, to never think you've got it and repeat old patterns. And the other invitation is the exact opposite. It's, wow, blimey, I can change the world because I can't do anything but change the world. Even if I do nothing and don't respond and say, this is all too complex, this is not beyond me, I'm just a little person and I can't do anything, I'm actually changing the world with having to taken that decision. It reminds me of this reframing of activism with the question. I learned this from a colleague of mine at Guy Education, May East. She put it beautifully, I think. Activists ask themselves every morning, what do I activate with the power of my intention? And it's basically, what story do we choose to live in? And I recognize that there are lots of far more underprivileged people than me. And I always feel at this point that I need to own my own privileges and say, it's easy to say these things. And there are lives that are extremely, like, I'm just about glad that I'm getting through the day and it's overwhelming me. Yeah. But we still have a choice. There is a moment of breath and response. And how do we feel ourselves as victims or as potential actors and agents in our situation? And everything changes. And so I think it's a very personal journey that needs a Sangha, that needs like-minded people to help. And I think we're all, like J.G. Bennett said 50 years ago, form communities or perish. So ultimately, we will form communities, but not necessarily the blingy, regenerative community eco-village that is becoming so trendy at the moment.
Yeah, I don't recall the name of the lady from the Barkana Institute that talks about the islands of sanity, right? Right, come down to these groups, to these little communities where you can create an island of sanity and do your own things. You brought me something that is very dear to me, and I think is this, somehow we've been called to have this balance of maybe this more masculine energy of action and, doing things in the world, with this more feminine aspects of holding space for being more delicate and meeting the world halfway, not going to the world with all our ideas of what it should be and what it needs to be, and be more delicate towards what is it that is there already and how I can contribute so that it can enhance what's already there, right? And for me, that's something, is like a daily exercise of keep reminding myself of am I being delicate or am I being intrusive? And it's such the way our culture is so embedded on this kind of narrative of penetrating the world, doing the world things so that it can move, that we lost this delicacy that I think indigenous people have, to really observe themselves, observe nature around, so that they can find a middle ground to engage in, and not one that is dominated by human perspective. And when I hear the questions around, for instance, financial system and economy, obviously these all need to change. We are kind of getting to a place, and I would like to hear a bit on your take on that. But I feel we are reaching a place of multiple collapses, of systemic collapses, and part of the systems we have in place in our society are at the verge of that collapse. So there's the sense that there's also the hints of new systems coming in, new in between brackets, but of new ways of structuring our interactions that can serve better. And yeah, so just to say, yes, from my side, the economy and the financial system need to change fundamentally and radically, and that needs this shift from a system that was created out of separation and individualism towards a system that is more tapping the potential of collective and the contribution that each individual has to the collective and to the ecosystems we are part of. So yeah, what do you think about that? in the context of working on restoration and regeneration?
Well, when just after finishing designing regenerative cultures, I asked myself where would be the highest intervention points in or one of the really high intervention points in all this, and because of part of what went wrong with our degenerative economic system that is using a measure like GDP, which is actually very often measuring degenerative impact and then registering a positive rise in GDP, like natural catastrophes can easily raise rather than lower GDP, and many other things like
the industrial military complex.
Yeah, exactly.
The industrial military complex contributes GDP.
So obviously that's needs to be redesigned, and so and part of that journey and the kind of unleashing that monster completely was when we went out of reserve or fractional reserve currencies into this casino market where money could just be created out of nothing, without the need for a fractional reserve. And so up to the fractional reserve time, money was somehow, not fully, but partially backed by real value. Since then, that's not the case anymore. It's an entire, you trust in it or you don't trust in it. Yeah? And the core question that I was asking myself then, but I wasn't techie enough, and I think a lot of people are now working on this in sort of techie spaces, is would it be possible to create a new type of currency that is backed by planetary bioproductivity? And so people can invest into real value that is it somehow linked to real regenerative activity on the land and real biomass. And I think we're finding ways to do these kind of things. Yeah, you said something else earlier that triggered me, but I've now forgot it. But we've only got about 15 minutes left. Are there any questions? Because I'm not following the chat. Yeah, I mean,
there was a question around funding, which you already tackled a bit.
Well, there's Patrick. Maybe he.
Yeah,
Patrick, welcome.
There were a lot of comments for sure. There's maybe one of the last questions is how to bring in this whole subject in maybe from a more practical point of view into education, and because I mean to shift the mindset maybe of the youngers. So that's one thing. Another thing which was addressed, and in some way it's also a question of mine. So there, what everything you say, you know, it sounds for me it's just logical. I mean, that's why I invited you after I heard you talking for the first time. But it's I mean, the first challenge is really to bring people into this line of thinking and feeling which you're presenting. So that's a challenge itself. Mm-hmm. But even if you have, like, let's say a certain number of people, communities trying to live this shift, you know, to have this more holistic, landscape-based, community-based, and regenerative in general approach. Currently, there are a lot of limitations, and some very practical ones, like just what the local law is, and which is very, very difficult to shift or to change. Just to give you an example, it's a meeting, by the way, where I met Nuno. Someone told me about agroforestry project, which after, I don't know, 2-3 years, suddenly there was a bulldozer there, because the municipality just decided that was not what was planned for that space, and destroyed the work of 3 years of agroforestry, because the law is quite clear there. The other example is like sustainable building, where you have auto-sustainable ways of building houses and so on, which then are not allowed by certain law in specific countries. So you have this constructs which are like hindering many people to advance with some approaches in the context of what we say. And on the other hand, and that's the other extreme, and that's what a comment said, is there are countries where people are with their hands, how do you say,
tied.
yeah,
Tied.
and this comment came from Colombia, where the political reality, and even if we go more in the context of military conflict reality, and I think Afghanistan is the extreme example in the latest weeks, where people were trying to build something up, and suddenly there's this higher power and forces which just destroy, at least for the moment, everything which was achieved until then, and stops it for probably a few years or decades. So what I'm saying is, like I said, shifting the mind and the approach of people is already a challenge itself, but then you need to have the space to live that. And I think Portugal, from my understanding, I have been living in Germany for a long time, is a very nice playground for people to experiment. So that's why we have so many foreign people coming to try new projects, and I have been meeting a lot of projects. And there's a shift happening, but there are so many other countries where this shift is so difficult, even if people want to and understand that they have to do it. Yeah, and I see we have also a lot of Brazilians today here. And Brazil is, from my understanding, one of these examples where a lot is happening. A lot has happened in the past, but there's again a very strong jump into the wrong direction, and maybe into the past due to political motivations. So yeah, maybe pass on this question. How do you deal with these walls or these handcuffs which impede many people to advance with their projects?
I'm sure that they exist in one way or another in almost every country. It's all kind of fractal because the inequality is everywhere. There are lots of people in Germany who might want to be regenerative and just don't make it to the end of the months. It's the selling the story that the industrialized global north is the land of plenty is an emperor that has no clothes anymore, increasingly. But of course, I feel it's very linked to what we were talking about earlier with the difference of looking at the problems or looking at potential. It's partial, or the question of, as an activist, what story do I choose to focus on? I know that, for example, in Colombia, there are lots of people working along the regenerative impulse. There's vibrant communities exploring how to transform the country's tourism industry to make it have regional regenerative impact. There are regenerative education initiatives. There's some expat initiatives that are partnering with local communities, like Joe Brewer's group in Baricha in Colombia, creating a community land trust and fundraising in the global north to then give out small community grants to action groups in that region. I think if we begin to look and it's good to be globally aware and connect as activists and as change makers, but I think we've done this, like we got carried away with it to the point that we're losing our local community involvement. And at least I hold up my own hand. Like, I came here to grow community roots, and I've noticed that in the last few years, I spent so much time on events like this or online that I have less contact with my friends and I have less contact with my community. And I'm making a real active commitment of trying to undo this pattern, because I think when we begin to look at what we can do in our community in place, we see a very different potential again. We can actually have small successes in the and I even feel that ultimately, and this might sound a bit depressing at the end of this conversation, but I think we need to come to a space where we hold the real and present possibility that runaway climate change has already been triggered to the point that the kind of global civilization we take for granted might not be something that the 23rd century will see. And that our children will have to come to grips with the fact that decisions were made by their ancestors, including us, or our parents, or our grandparents, that led to a situation that is now globally not fully reversible. But it doesn't mean that we have to suffer and live non-meaningless lives or fight for survival in a kind of downhill spiral. That's not the case. If we deepen into understanding ourselves as life again, we can maybe build a culture that can let go. Let go. But with a deep commitment that what we leave behind has a chance to regenerate again. And to identify with life as a planetary process to the point that we don't feel the grief of disappearance fully, because we don't see ourselves as just us. We see ourselves as life. And since we're at the point now, because we left it so late, 50 years of knowing that we needed to change because of climate change and for many other reasons, and we've done next to nothing. We now don't know whether we're going to make it or not. But I believe that the pathway of localizing and regionalizing economies and ecosystems restoration, building healthy relationships with place and community again, and regenerating local ecosystems, restoring local ecosystems, the soil, the forests, the water, the waterways, is the way we can hedge our bet. Either we make the miracle happen, we go through that rite of passage as a species, and we claim our right of becoming a regenerative species in place everywhere again, and we actually create a regenerative future, or we create the conditions that, if we've left it too late, for another couple of generations, we can have meaningful existences in place with the local community resilience to climate change, that we don't have to suffer the way we would if we don't take that path. So it's for me, it's not the question anymore of, are you a climate optimist or are you a climate pessimist? I mean, my friends who are like Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac, who are trying to fight the windmills of the global economy and do it the carbon counting way. Beautiful book. They also hold this understanding that it might already be too late. And they talk about stubborn optimism. I think we need to have this stubborn optimism, and also we need to have the understanding that the way we can change patterns is by living differently. And that's done through the future potential of the present moment. It's not done by blueprints and strategies and roadmaps and where we're going to be in 2030 and 2050. It's by doing it differently now.
Plans and, yeah. I resonate a lot with you, Daniel. Patrick, just let me say one thing, because this relates a lot with the work I'm doing with Jill and Constança here in Portugal, that one of the things we realize doing this work is, one side is we can't arrive to an institution or to a company and say to the CEO or to the administrator, this is what you have to do and this is the way or that. We actually need to shift that and work in a different way. So work in a way that we can see where they are at and where we can, through interactions and questions, help them, assist them in their own developmental process that they need to do. And that also brings us back to us, that the way we've been doing that, because we recognize that first we need to have a beginner's mind. We can't go somewhere and think we know everything. We need to go there with a fresh look and really look things from a very humbled place. And we need to help each other to recognize constantly and to check each other to see if we are not falling on the habitual ways of looking, which are fragmented, separated, and really be able to have this way of seeing that is coming from living systems, that is alive, interdynamic, in relationships, wholes internested with wholes. So we need, I mean, Carol Sanford that Daniel already mentioned, or some of the guys at Regenesis, they often say you need at least 5 to 10 years of constantly working on yourself in this way so that you can find a place where you can actually kind of stop constantly reminding yourself that you need to be, am I thinking in the right way? So it's really not like the change is going to happen just like that. We need to work on ourselves constantly and with each other so that then systems can start to have new dynamics in place. And I think that's very, very important for what we're talking about. Otherwise, we're always expecting change to take place somewhere else, or we're just thinking we know everything and we just need to convince everybody around to do it our way, So change happens in the distance of our arm. And what Daniel said lastly, and I think it's what for me is most important to live as a message, is the way we relate with each other and with our places today is what the future will look like. We need to stop thinking like the future lies ahead. We're going to live, if only we do this and that, we'll arrive at the final destination. No, it's by living in the process of interacting with each other on everyday basis that the future will come. And it's about what we do today and not what we're going to do tomorrow or after tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe I would also, as we are achieving our time, I would ask maybe Daniel also to leave to end up with a very short but powerful message. And I invite you later on. I will send you the links so to revisit also some comments of the public which we could not all bring into this conversation. But yeah. Go ahead, or maybe before that,
can I maybe announce that for all of those of you who have been hearing this wonderful book by Daniel, the Regenerative Bible, on giving some hints, a lot of hints on how to design regenerative cultures, is going to be available. It's being published in Portuguese by a wonderful new publishing house called Bambuão, which is a sister house from a Brazilian publishing house, also the same name. Gabriel Ludovici is one of our friends, is the host behind all that, and is going to be in the festival, in the market on the 5th of October in the Príncipe Real Garden in Lisbon. And to the first 10 people who go there and say, Viva a Regeneração, you'll get one copy for yourself. So the first 10 of you who get there and say Viva Regeneração will get this wonderful companion. Anyway, buy it. It's well worth the money, and it's contributing a lot for the evolution of this publishing house so that people like Daniel and others who bring a great voice to the space can be heard in multiple places and work can continue to evolve. Thank you once again.
And I might add, if you're not amongst the first 10, everyone else gets also 30% discount.
Oh, wow.
So just
Gabriel is not going to make any money on this.
No.
We're trying to finally.
He's too generous. I'm telling him, you need to have some sustainability coming in.
But let me invited me. No hard challenge to say something powerful. And we mentioned the power of paradox, and I think we really need to embrace this. Like that, it's all deadly serious, and we have to take it lightly. Yeah. And it's all like the Buddhist practice of counting one's blessing rather than getting overwhelmed by the mess that particularly when you switch on the news, it feels just overwhelmingly messy. And I feel that I also mentioned it before, that simple practice of beginning to ask oneself whenever one can in terms of life decisions and how we live our lives, does it serve myself? Does it serve my family or community? Does it serve life? And to really ask this question with how we guide our decisions of how are we, like sometimes it's not possible to transform one's life from one day to the next, even if you feel stuck in your old situation. But it is possible to reach out to other people and create community and build the conditions and the capacity to co-create a different life together. And I think that's the invitation towards community, and community toward not just with human beings, community with place. Like it's not just it's actually a gift to give to oneself, to find your special place in your locality where you can sit under a tree and ask for insight and ask for sustenance, and to rediscover that this is our inheritance as a regenerative species, that there is a connection that we've just ignored for so long, that can re-energize us even in the darkest and the most depressed and horrible of moments. Like nature is my biggest solace. It's where I go to find answers, and I find support. And biophilia, the love for life, is innate in human beings. And this is where in a very deep level, I put my trust in life. I put my trust in us being part of life. And that the more we get pushed into this seemingly impossible VUCA situation, the more we're actually coming back to life. And that will change the game.
Yeah. So thank you so much for this last words. I thank you everyone that participated. We had a quite big audience, and everyone speaking Portuguese in this case is invited to follow our program. So we still have dozens and dozens of events today until Tuesday, also online, maybe for our Brazilian colleagues and from Angola, Mozambique, and so on. And it was a pleasure to have you both here. It's always really a pleasure to hear you. It really inspires. And thank you so much for everyone. I hope to see you soon again in some other, maybe physical environment, and not always in front of the computer.
Viva la regeneração.
Yeah.
Viva.
Goodbye to everyone.
Thank you so much. Okay. Bye-bye. Have a wonderful day. Bye.